So, as much as we've talked about the positive reasons why countries want to trade, there's also reasons that they choose not to. Because if it's felt that jobs are going overseas because of lower wages in other parts of the world, or money is leaving Canada or the United States to another country to pay for imported goods, politicians may put trade barriers in place to limit how much that is uh, occurring. The trade barriers are restrictions on trade that can be financial or legal. So, throughout the Trump presidency, he would put tariffs on aluminum. A lot of aluminum is made in Quebec and it's being used by US companies. And he would say, well, I'm protecting Americans. I'm making them choose local US aluminum companies instead of Canada. And so, even as recently as a few months before the 2020 election, he chose to act.
It hasn't exactly been a great summer for any industry. Now this.
Earlier today, I signed a proclamation that defends American industry by reimposing aluminum tariffs on Canada.
Just weeks after the new NAFTA deal came into effect, U.S. President Donald Trump is throwing a stick in the spokes of Canada-U.S. trade.
Canada was taking advantage of us.
A tariff, though, is just a fancy word for a tax on Americans buying products made with Canadian aluminum.
It doesn't mean we're not going to shut down smelters because of this. We're not going to lay people off or anything.
So the real hit won't be on Canadians at all.
He's making everything from F-150s to fighter jets to a can of beer more expensive.
But Trump clearly feels the need to change the channel. COVID cases in the U.S. remain unsettlingly high. His support is plummeting, an election just 89 days away. So, should Canada strike back or wait and see what November brings?
We can probably swallow a 10% tariff. There's a reason why we're the major supplier to the United States. They need that product. And so ultimately, it's just American consumers that will pay. That's the kind of smart response.
So the question is less what this may mean for the Canadian industry and more, how will a liberal minority in Ottawa respond to this latest provocation? Peter Armstrong, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, Peter touched on something there. This does feel political as much as it does economic. So let's bring in Rob Russo, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for CBC News. Rob, it does feel significant that Trump made this announcement in the Rust Belt. So why Ohio? Why now?
Well, who would have thought that the road to the presidency might rumble through places like Kitimat and Jonquière, Quebec, where the aluminum smelters are? But that's true. Ohio is a swing state, and it is the most important swing state. No Republican president has won the presidency without winning in Ohio. And right now, a couple of numbers. Trump is behind in the polls there by a point or two, and there are 89 days to go until that election in the United States.
All right, so that might work for the president, but what options does the Canadian government have in response to this, and really should it be using those options?
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said tonight that they're going to match these tariffs dollar for dollar, but they can't be as strategic as they were in trade wars past, where they went after swing states, Kentucky, for instance, with bourbon, Florida with oranges, because they're limited to sectoral response, in other words, aluminum tariffs. So they might just be forced to wait until the Trump tornado blows through if he's defeated by Joe Biden in November.
All right, Rob Russo, Parliamentary Bureau.
So there you get an idea of the motivations behind tariffs. For Trump, maybe he wanted to say that he's protecting American workers. Maybe he wanted a distraction. So what that means is a 10% tariff on aluminum is the U.S. government would collect a 10% tax on the price of the value of aluminum that is shipped from Canada to the U.S. So the producers are now paying 10% more. But if you think about it, aluminum's a raw material. So if the cost of any raw material goes up, it's just passed on to the consumer. So whether it's a a beer can, if the price of aluminum in a pop can or a beer can goes up, they're just going to charge the consumer more for each drink to factor in that new cost. So it's not, the idea is, well, maybe if people see that aluminum from the US is cheaper than Canada, they'll make the switch. But as many of the analysts pointed out, Canada has a very dominant position in aluminum, and the US needs a lot of aluminum, so they don't have the option to pick and choose, and probably would just be a price increase passed on to the consumers. So, our tariffs. What are tariffs? They could also be called customs duties. It's a form of tax on a certain type of import. When goods are imported, that the tariffs, it's meant to make them more expensive compared to the domestic counterparts. So when you look at the price of, a finished imported good, what the final total landed cost is, it includes tariffs. So that would increase their prices. So the landed cost of a good is going to include its initial price, the price to ship it there, and then also any tariffs. And then those little increases raise the price relative to other products. And as a result, the domestic products that are next to them on the shelf won't have those tariffs, and they can be sold at lower prices. And these tariff barriers increase the relative cost of the imported goods. So hopefully people will choose, according to the politician, choose the domestic product instead, as it's cheaper. And some of the first tariffs were done by Hoover at the beginning of the Great Depression to encourage people to buy more American goods. There's also non-tariff barriers. For example, limiting the quantities or setting strict standards and requirements that make it difficult to reach. So the first non-tariff barrier would be a limit on quantities. So that a quota is a limit on how many products that can be imported. So you might have seen when you travel that there's a limit about how much an individual person can bring back duty-free. So a quota is like a type of those limits. It limits how many products can enter Canada during a given year. And the non-tariff barriers include high standards. So there's to protect the local Asian clothing and tapestry market from cheap imitators. There's very high standards for the type of tapestry, the type of rugs, the type of threads, and everything that goes into it. They can only be made in a specific location in order to get the special certification, and the permit's limited. So that's as a way to sort of protect local fabric and tapestry artisans in Asia. Just the fact that there's additional costs. For example, if the price of shipping goes up, well, that's going to have the function of a trade barrier because the landed cost of every good is going to go up. If there's additional precautions are required because of COVID-19, that will increase the landed cost of a good and make it more expensive, and as a result, people may choose the domestic equivalent. Excise taxes is a tax on the sale or consumption of a product within a country. So tariffs are taxes that happen when the importation occurs. Excise taxes are imposed on consumption. So for example, an excise tax could be imposed on alcohol when the alcohol is purchased, not when it crosses the border, but an additional tax when it is purchased by the consumer. And automobiles may also have excess taxes, not when it crosses the border, but when the consumer buys it. Currency fluctuations are a type of barrier. You'll always see in the newspaper the price of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar. The higher the Canadian dollar is, the more you can buy with your Canadian money. So that will encourage you to buy more. And if the Canadian dollar is doing well, businesses will import more goods because they get more bang for their buck. Likewise, if the Canadian dollar falls and you see, you go to the Yahoo Finance website and that chart, for the Canadian dollar is in red, it means the value of the Canadian dollar is going down and it's more expensive to import goods. But then on the other hand, Canadian goods are going to be cheaper on the world market. So those currency fluctuations can be a barrier. One example of currency fluctuations is that China has purposely kept their currency low to boost how many Chinese goods people want. So as a result, they purposely are keeping the yuan or the renminbi low so that people want to buy Chinese goods and they want to import goods from China into their country. And they've been accused of currency manipulation because they have done this.
China's currency, much like the country itself, was for decades something of a mystery in the financial world. The renminbi, which means people's currency, was brought into being in 1948 by the Chinese Communist Party. For several decades, it was exchanged at various unsatisfactory levels, until in 1997 it was pegged to the US dollar. The peg was removed in 2005 as Beijing began a process of internationalizing the renminbi, but the exchange rate remained tightly controlled, with movements permitted only within a narrow band set by the central bank. Offshore renminbi bank accounts were permitted. Chinese people could hold renminbi savings off the mainland. In an effort to promote the circulation of the currency outside China, in 2009, China began allowing approved companies to settle trade payments with non-Chinese customers using the renminbi. A fifth of China's foreign trade is now settled in the currency, compared with just 3% in 2010. The use of RMB for trade payments has resulted in the build-up of the renminbi outside China. RMB centres have been established in a number of financial capitals, several in Asia-Pacific, but also in places such as London, Frankfurt, Paris, and Luxembourg. Hong Kong holds most of these deposits, with 900 billion yuan, about half the global total. 5 years ago, the RMB was the 35th most traded currency in the world. Today, it is the 5th biggest, although at slightly more than 2% of the global total, it is dwarfed by the dollar and the euro. China wants to take the internationalization of the currency a step further by having it included in the basket of currencies that make up the fund's special drawing rights, or SDR. That would amount to an official endorsement of the RMB as a reserve currency. One key IMF criterion for SDR is whether currencies are freely tradable. The US has long wanted China to stop intervening to support its currency in the foreign exchange market. But most currency strategists believe that while China is committed to reducing intervention, the government isn't willing to give market forces complete free rein over the exchange rate. US complaints about Chinese intervention to keep the currency deliberately low for reasons of trade competitiveness have been around for years. But the RMB has gradually appreciated in value since 2005, save for a 2-year hiatus around the global financial crisis. Although it did begin falling again early in 2014 and has kept within a narrow trade band since then. Some investment bank researchers believe further intervention will come from Beijing in the form of monetary easing. China may be the world's biggest economy, but growth is slowing as China begins the task of converting its economy from one based on investment to one focused on consumption. And the economy is suffering from deflationary pressures. Capital outflows are on the rise, and the shock sell-off in Chinese equity markets this year, which has seen the Shanghai index fall by 30% since the middle of June, has prompted some dramatic intervention by the Chinese authorities to restrict sales. The more China heads along the path of financial liberalization, the more it will be exposed to the volatile nature of the global markets. This is a challenge.
So that's a bit of a lot of information, and issues like that are discussed more thoroughly in international business. The essential point is that the government tightly controls the RMB, so it doesn't trade freely like the Canadian and US dollar does, where it can move up and down based on market forces. They limit like how much of it is out in circulation so that it will not, become too valuable. So it stays within a certain range, and as a result, Chinese products are a lot cheaper, and so they've been accused of artificially keeping it low. And that's a combination. If they want to join the world economy, they want to be in the special drawing rights basket, but on the other hand, they need to be freely traded to be in that basket, versus if they have a cheap currency, people will demand their goods more and they will make more money on international trade. So you want to understand why governments might impose barriers on imported products. It could be they're concerned that too much money is leaving their country, and as a result, jobs are suffering. They could have a local sector, a local economy that they want to protect. For example, you might want to protect the Canadian dairy industry. You wouldn't want big dairy companies from the US to flood the market and put those Canadian dairy farms out of business. There might just be for political reasons, because it could be politically expeditious to stand up for Canada, and those would be some of the main reasons to impose trade barriers. Not all people view trade as good, because people can think that it encourages us to be consume a lot, it can depress wages, and so some political parties maybe make an argument that trade should be reduced, and they would use trade barriers to accomplish this. You might think, in Canada, there's no real, trade barriers from one province to another, but actually there's actually a lot of rules and regulations about what you can take across provincial borders. We don't think of that in Toronto because we don't cross provincial borders a lot, but there is actually regulations on what certain types of products, for example, alcohol, can cross the border between Quebec and New Brunswick.
Ask passerby outside MB Liquor in Campbellton about bringing beer over the border, and you'll find almost everyone does it, but they aren't sure how much is legal. Do you know the limit right now?
No.
For beer, it's 18 bottles or cans.
Oh, geez, that's not enough. Geez.
Shocking to some. For others, it's maddening.
I think it's ridiculous. We're living in Canada. Why can't I go and get a dozen cases of beer if I want? I mean, you can buy 12 cans or 12 cans there for $17, and here's about 27. Big difference.
Those kind of savings lure people from all over northern New Brunswick to the Quebec border town of Pointe-à-la-Croix. They come from as far away as Tracadie, a 2-hour drive, where Gerard Como lives. Michael Bernard is his lawyer.
He had 10 different cases of beer, 3 bottles of liquor.
Como was charged in a raid by RCMP in 2012. He's fighting his fine of $292.50. Bernard is taking on the case for free in hopes of changing the law. He's also representing 4 others charged in the same raid.
We reached an agreement with the Crown that ultimately the result that would follow with the Como case that we would apply to the other individuals that were arrested on that same day.
Bernard and his team are funded by the Canadian Constitution Foundation. It hopes to strike down the New Brunswick law that prohibits the transport of more than 18 bottles of beer across the border. Markham, Ontario lawyer Arnold Schweisberg.
Section 121 of our Constitution says that the produce, goods, and manufacturer of every provinces, every one of them, shall be, quote, admitted free, quote, into all the other provinces. In this particular case, we have liquor that not only wasn't admitted free from Quebec to New Brunswick, it wasn't admitted at all because it was in fact confiscated.
At an earlier hearing, the presiding judge told the courtroom this case would be revolutionary if the lawyers succeed.
So maybe that sort of shows you a microcosm of how a trade barrier comes to be, for political reasons, historical reasons. Starting with prohibition, it was banned from province to province, and then provinces still wanted to retain some kind of political control, and then also perhaps the reason that there might be local wineries or breweries or distilleries in their province which they want to protect. And even though we're all within one country, trade barriers can exist.